good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on your location. We want to welcome you once again to our class discussion in 1 Corinthians. We have, over the course of many weeks, been going through the chapters of this great epistle written to the Corinthian brethren by the Apostle Paul. Last week we began in the 15th chapter. We were discussing the first few verses of that chapter. And we're going to, once again, we'll start with those and move forward. We're glad to have you joining us. Dave and Eileen, Michael, Paul, Sonny, and Brian are our fellow commentators. So I'll start out by reading these verses that we were discussing last week and move forward a little bit. Moreover, brethren, I declare unto you the gospel which I preached unto you, which also ye have received, and where ye stand, by which also ye are saved, if you keep in memory that what I preached unto you, unless you have believed in vain. For I delivered unto you, first of all, that which I also received, how that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he rose again the third day according to the Scriptures. That was pretty much the area that we covered last week, or were beginning in our discussion last week, and of course along with that we talked about some of the things that are inherent in Paul's discussion. The very first things that he talks about, certainly the importance of the gospel, and that of course allowed him to move forward into some of the very first facts regarding the gospel, how that Jesus died for our sins according to the Scriptures, how he was buried and rose also according to the Scriptures. Verses 5 through 7, which we'll get to shortly, speak to the fact of eyewitnesses, and we want to talk about the importance of eyewitnesses in a moment. But I was writing some information yesterday, Michael, with regard to the idea of the youth, and going along with verse 9 in Philippians chapter 4, where Paul speaks of the things that have been learned from him, etc. And I thought about that verse and, of course, 1 Corinthians chapter 15. And it caused me to wonder, when we are developing young people for the roles of in the church in the future, and I also made a comparison with that with the idea of preacher training schools, etc. And I want to stop. This may be sort of a stop, not a stop gap, but an insertion at this particular point. And the idea here that Paul says, I delivered unto you, first of all, that which I also received. Where did the need for preacher training schools come in? When we talk about training our young men, training young men for service in the Lord's church, training young men for the various roles that we see in terms of leadership, whether they become elders or deacons, or whether they are the member that is just faithful, the member that participates, the member that comes in and takes care of the yard, or takes care of the bathrooms, or where do we find the need for preacher training schools, as opposed to what should be the inherent responsibility of the local congregation? Now, before you start, let me say, I don't want to say that preacher training schools did not begin with the right purpose, but let me back away from that now and allow you to speak.
They're based on principle that you find going back to the Old Testament with the school of the prophets, for example. In the New Testament, you had Paul taking with him certain workers. Timothy is a good illustration, and Titus, in which he trained them. And so there is the sense that there's the need for training. coming down to real briefly leaving all of that to more modern times, the schools, Christian colleges at the time, took care of that. But as they started going into apostasy, some recognized the need for the training and realized that the colleges were not giving them sufficient training, so they started with schools.
That being you said the colleges, and the colleges, of course, usually would have a Bible department.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, and thus the Bible training that they would receive there, and basically becoming a Bible major, having a major in Bible. But that, in reality, as far as colleges went, you could get a major in Bible and still know very little Bible.
Clarify that. You just made a bold statement there.
Well, the way in which colleges are designed, you're basically with individuals who many times don't really care that much about Bible knowledge, and so the teacher is really having to skim the surface, trying to teach those who don't have much interest in it, don't know anything, and as a result, you're not giving the students really an in-depth study of it. And that's true with anything in relationship to any study. If you're getting an initial degree in any area, there's the immediate need to, if you really want to have an in-depth knowledge of it, to go into further studies.
Grad school.
Right, grad schools. So colleges weren't, plus the fact that at that time colleges were seen as starting to go astray and starting to really not be what they should be. Now today,
and Abilene and so.
Yeah, today you look at the Christian colleges, and they've basically all have apostatized.
There's not one that we could even recommend.
No, there's not one that I would recommend. So there was the need, saying that we need to have some better teaching, and so the schools of preaching came up. There's nothing wrong with them from a scriptural standpoint, but what we have seen through the years is that people become more what's the word that I'm trying to think of? They are more loyal to the school than they are to the scriptures. And
that's an introduction of politics.
Yeah, well, that, and there's the feeling that is presented, and in fact specifically stated many times in schools, the schools of preaching, is that you owe us, and thus there's that feeling of loyalty which they try to promote within their students.
Now, let me stop you for a second. The idea of them being owed something, why would they say that? Is the education free?
They're making the teaching of it free.
It's like the military academies.
Right. You're not having to pay for the courses. You're not paying for the teachers. You just have to get your own support and come here and be accepted, of course, in the school, and then you can come to class. So it is being offered for free, and that's from that standpoint. And thus, you owe this school because we are providing all of this education for you and doing it for free, and so you owe us. And then just the nature of the schools themselves is to engender loyalty to the school. The problem is, and really what should be presented is that the only way in which you can be loyal to this school is by being loyal to Christ. But it's not that being presented many times. It is, you have to be loyal to the school. You owe the school so much because we're providing all of this for you. We're providing your education, and you wouldn't have all of this without us.
Those things may be true, but that's really not the way to present it.
No, but that I know that it is presented that way.
Mm-hmm.
So while the principle of the school is right as far as the principles it's based on, there's nothing wrong with it. That's not the only way to do it. And many times that's a bad way to do it now.
The schools.
The schools. Because, well, the Christian colleges aren't going to do it now, but the schools are promoting that idea of loyalty to the school. And a lot of them are going there. A lot of students are going there who really don't care.
They're looking for mates.
Well, no, I'm talking about the schools of preaching. Even.
Oh, okay. Okay. The colleges they go for looking for.
Yeah, a lot of times colleges they do go for mates. But even with the schools of preaching, you're finding a lot of these kids that are going in because the school is wanting to grow numerically and get big numbers and being able to promote themselves that way. They're not really putting in the time and the effort. I'm talking about the students now, in learning and digging out. So
not only that, but I've noticed over a few years, and there are different variations on this, that we've seen young men come out of different schools who bring some of the doctrine from those schools.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the one I'm thinking about more specifically is the Sunset School, which used to be the Sunset School of Preaching, and it is now the Sunset International Bible Institute. And of course, a lot of the people who have come out of those schools come out with a certain doctrinal slant in a number of areas, and they're quite extensive in their farming system. I'll say farming system because not only do they generate a large number of students, but putting them out into the congregations with those doctrines, and then eventually, ultimately, setting up satellite schools or satellites in those congregations, extending their influence. And looking at that, it's one of the things that caused me, as I was looking at this passage that Paul was talking about here, that which he also received, and it caused me to think of how do people receive the gospel? How are they taught? What is the responsibility that we have in the local congregation to teaching the gospel properly, rightly dividing the word of truth, making sure that what a person learns from their conversion, regardless of the external circumstances, that everyone's going to have something a little different, but trying to make sure that we are all, I think it's Ephesians 4:12, equipped for the ministry. And the ministry, of course, not just mean preaching, but for all facets of congregational work. And what I'm including in one of my chapters is I think that this idea has not outgrown itself, but gotten to the point where congregations are now depending on someone else to do work that I think is inherently the work of really the work of the local congregation. When you take a young man, and this doesn't mean young women don't learn, of course, as Paul wrote, the older ladies to teach the younger ladies. But I think that the responsibility of the men of the congregation, the older men, is to teach younger men, to give them. Now, of course, I could go on through that in terms of what should be taught, but if you can send someone somewhere to be taught and then have them come back, that saves you a lot of work. But it also may allow us to become complacent in our own study. What ensures the proper transfer of the mantle than home teaching? And I think that that's the kind of thing that in all the congregations we should spend a little bit more time on. You were going to say something.
Well, there's another inherent problem I see in the way in which we do things many times in accomplishing that. There have been preachers who, just to put it very simply, they were lazy. And it was well known. You have about 2 years of sermons. You would go to a place, you preach those 2 years of sermons, and then you move on someplace else. And you preach those 2 years of sermons, and you move someplace else.
Well, that as I understood it was something that I don't want to speak incorrect. Well, I understood that in some of the preacher training schools that's what they did. They gave them a bundle of 2 years worth of sermons, and then they put them out into the wild.
I think actually that even arose before the preacher training schools. Just look at the number of preachers who move every few years. There's congregations that they're going to be moving and changing the preacher every couple of years no matter what. And so there was the attitude both on the standpoint of the preachers but also congregations that we don't want you here too long.
Well, that's a different issue, but yes, that's another problem.
But what I'm saying and tying it to is, if you have that type of attitude and the congregation has that type of attitude, that really doesn't give you time to get someone there and study with them and develop them in order to take the mantle. You're going someplace else. I mean, it takes you, takes you a few months to unpack and a few months to pack, and you've got maybe a year.
In many of those cases, it sort of is the result of men who, in some cases, not every case, but in some cases where you may not have an eldership, you may have men who want to lord over or want to maintain a degree of power, all those kinds of problems. And the number of issues that we deal with in the church on a regular basis, you can't even begin a role for that. But it does say something when you're only interested in staying someplace for a few years until you run out of sermons. But I think you've been there almost. You and I and David, I know, have been in one place now for at least 15, 16, 17 or more years. I think I've been here almost 20 years now, and I don't remember how long David's been at Spring, but I think around 17 years, 18 years, something like that. And
he moved to Spring in '93.
Oh, okay, so 23 years.
I
Wow.
remember that because I moved here a year later in '94.
Wow. Well, I remember when you went to Bellevue. I didn't know of you before you went to Bellevue, but I remember when you went to Bellevue because Bobby Liddell was there before.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I think that that men in the congregation, and I know just a little bit about at the point, I know that Sonny works with the different men there and tries to develop them, and they do a variety of things, and I think that stems out of a number of purposes. One, humility. Second, understanding of congregational development. Um, you have to have, in order for a congregation to continue, and I mean continue beyond ourselves, you have to have people who are trained and ready to take over the reins to keep the congregation going forward. And looking toward the future. And in the church today, there are tremendous difficulties. When we think of standing for the truth today and looking at where so many brethren have decided to go, Paul says, that which I also received. And he talks about the preciousness of the gospel, the importance of the fundamentals of the gospel, that Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures, buried, rose again, the third day according to the scriptures. This, of course, something that was obviously included in that sermon that he gave in Acts chapter 17, because he reached that point of discussion about the resurrection that caused such a hullabaloo there when they heard of the resurrection, and then everything went downhill from there. And I think this is the kind of thing that fundamental to, Paul, I keep saying that, but the writer of Hebrews, let me just back up. The writer of Hebrews talks about toward the end of chapter 5, I believe it's verses 11, 12, and following, and then going into chapter 6, talks about the importance of spiritual growth, the fact that you have to get beyond the first principles, the fact that you have to move on. And that means that the older men in the congregation have to continue. We have to continue to have men in the congregation study the scriptures, delve deeper, continuing to push for study on the behalf of every man in the congregation, utilizing a variety of tools. I've always said that, just to get started, get yourself a Vines. You can't get anything simpler than a Vines, but Vines is great, really. That's a quick reference you can go to for Old and New Testament words. It takes the King James. I think now they even do one with. They may do one in several versions now, but I know they do the King James, the New King James. And you can see the book you can see the word in English. You can go there in the Vines and look it up in English. It gives you the Greek text. It gives you a little bit, not too much of an etymology, but it gives you how the word is used. Why aren't we doing that, Michael?
Oh man, why aren't we? I think.
No, let me roll it back a little bit before I roll it back out. Everyone expects the preacher to do that.
Yeah.
But and in some instances, even the elders expect the preacher to do that. But why don't all the members show that sort of interest, even as we encourage it all the time?
I think there's probably a lot of reasons. Part of them worldly, like we just get so busy with the things of this world that we don't have the time to do it, supposedly. Part of it's interest. How many things are competing for our interest nowadays? And we only have so much time to give to them. Part of it is that the preacher himself doesn't really do it, and doesn't. How many people, and here it goes back to our educational system as well, how many people know how to study? If you ask,
well, that's one of the that that question there is one of the very first things that has to be, how do you study the scriptures?
Yeah.
You know, when you, how, you know, do you just, you have to have a system. There has to be a methodology. There has to be, I mean, just if you can almost look at it as the way we used to in school, break down a sentence grammatically. I mean,
People
of
don't know how to
course.
do that nowadays because they're not taught. And that goes back, and I said the educational system. That does go back to the educational system. People don't know how to do those things.
But
So,
but you have to teach. No kid going into college just knows everything once they get there.
no.
You can say high school. You can start with high school, I suppose. Young minds, people say, well, they want to have an opinion about things. But you can't have an opinion about things if you don't know how to arrive at the proper conclusion. There's a logic, and I know we talked about this in our classes. People don't like logic because it means you have to work to think. And it means you have to take facts and not emotions, and that you have to look at what you have in front of you to draw a conclusion. You know, and once you know, if what I think you're saying also incorporated in this is there's a lack of love and enthusiasm on the part of many brethren, preachers perhaps, for the truth itself. They don't have a love for the truth.
I think there is a lack of that, but also you don't get the desire to study unless you start studying. The more you can see the beauty of a passage and looking at it from different aspects and seeing the implications of it, until you start doing that, you don't have the desire to do it. And actually seeing it done can produce that desire. Let me complain a little bit about the Bible classes that we have nowadays. We're going to study the Bible, okay? We're just going to take a Bible text. What are we going to do? Well, we've got to get through this entire chapter in one class of,
Why?
40 minutes or so. You know it as well as I do, but sometimes you have to take 2 or 3 chapters in that 40-minute period. There can be no study when you do that.
No.
You're just, and yet you talk about trying to go through a study, 1 Corinthians, for example, and say, okay, we're going to spend about 5 years studying 1 Corinthians. And people after a year are going to be, I'm tired of this. Now you know exactly what I'm talking about, don't you?
Yes, I do. I do.
And we need to move on to something else. And they never learn thus the beauty of study, because all that we've ever done through our history is skim over and never gotten into any depth in relationship to it.
Well, one of the things that we're, when you mentioned that, right now we're in the process on Sunday mornings, and I just mentioned to the congregation, this is what we're going to do. I said for the next however long it takes, we're going to go through 2 texts that I, just so that we wouldn't be on just one text, that I think are similar in a lot of ways and equally. I said probably equally as deep in terms of the way the subject matter is presented anyway. So we're slowly moving through Romans and Ephesians. And so every Sunday now, they know that the sermon's going to, and we're just moving along, start with Romans chapter 1 and Ephesians 1, and I might do 2 sermons from Romans and then 1 or 2 from Ephesians, but Romans and Ephesians. So every week now it's Romans or Ephesians. and we're just going to be on that until we're done. But I think that, you know, and the sermons are longer now, but but I think that by trying to take time to get people to see the beauty of those verses, the depth of thought that God put in those verses for us to excavate. I think that has a long-range, long-term benefit, and it gets people excited about the scriptures.
That's exactly what I'm talking about, but with most congregations, you cannot do that because we've got to get this, and we've got a plan that we've got to get through this entire section within 13 weeks, usually.
Well,
and you know exactly what I'm talking about in relationship to that.
Yeah. And in our Wednesday night class, now we started a study of the life of David. I have no idea how long that's going to take. It's just we've been in chapter 25 now for a few weeks, and we'll probably be there for at least another week. But the class has been very supportive and enjoying of the material. Now, I think after next week, we're going to go into the book from your series Typology, which I realized that just talking about it to the congregation was not going to be enough to get them to understand it. So we showed a couple of the videos, and boy, the interest exploded. They said, "Wow, I never really," you know, and the responses were all pretty similar. Wow, I never thought about it like that. Wow, I never saw that as part of a larger, you know, and people said, can we study this too? And I said, sure, we'll get some books, and what we'll get the books, and what we'll do is they have questions at the end. We'll study whatever amount that we can study, and maybe we can get through one in a couple weeks or so, but we'll take the time to do it. And we've done this with a number of studies, have 2 ongoing studies at the same time. But it's that kind of thing that also, for those who are in those classes, I hope gives them a sense of how to study and present class material themselves.
Yeah.
And I think that when we work with our young men, and we have a really good group of young men, they can all put together, they all do, they don't all sing as well, but they all sing. They're all willing to get up there and lead songs. They're not all always on pitch, but they're not shy. And if the person who's supposed to be leading singing that particular week is not there, no one hesitates to go and grab a song book and pick out some songs to get started. They all know, of course, the first thing that everyone learns how to do is serve communion, but they all now have done. They've all done Bible classes. They all can preach, and just having that has given us something that I think as a congregation looking forward to the future. So Sonny, let's have you weigh in on this now a little bit.
What is it about? I got cut off halfway. Sorry.
Well, just the congregational development.
Oh, well, I mean, Paul, you know that I have always tried to encourage men to try to be involved in the teaching and preaching itself. I mean, I wasn't from a Bible school. I was self-taught, so I do not have the kind of abilities like you guys who have been to Bible school. Been taught how to prepare a sermon. I prepared it through years of experience, learning and knocking myself here and there, and that's the only way I could share what I know. like what Paul says in it, I delivered to you what I received. So what I received may be informal, but at least there was something that I received and I learned from it, and I try to share and encourage men to do that. I mean, that certainly that the church cannot rely on just simply on one person or two persons. You know, the next generation of Christians need to step in and learn and grow from it and develop so that they can take the church to the next generation. I've always believed in that, you know, and if we don't do it now, then you know, the church will never survive. You know, let's say if when I pass from this world, who's going to do it next? I mean, unless I start doing it now, encouraging men to come forward and do the teaching and preaching, and thank God that we got many around now, and Paul is picking up pace as well. So you know, I think that we'll get there eventually. It takes time.
Good. I was going to ask. It sounds off. Paul, what did he say?
No, I said nothing, Paul.
Oh. I was wondering how many.
Sorry, say again, Johnny.
I was asking how many.
You're fading.
How many?
How is
many? He's doing good, and I think that his sermons are as usual dynamic and lively and well researched as well and thought through, and he's back on fire. Yes.
And that's the kind of thing that I only met Manny maybe once or twice, and Sonny had mentioned him on a number of occasions, and he he had some difficulties, but he came back, and he seems to be a very dynamic person in the community there. He seems to be a person. He's a young man, and again you have Brian there who he's sort of self-deprecating in some sense. He's humble. I think that more than anything else, he's a humble man. But he's such a wonderful person.
Take it easy.
No. For those who don't know, Brian is knowledgeable in the scriptures. He's probably, as so many are, self-taught. But at the same time, he has a passion for the scriptures. He loves people. You have all these different components in the church, and young people coming into the church learn from different people different things. And I think this is why, to go back to the original idea when I looked at that, and I'm in the process of writing a few chapters on Philippians chapter 4, verse 9, where Paul there is discussing the things that they have seen, learned and seen, and so forth. And I thought about this, and how do we do this on a local level now, or are we really doing it efficiently and effectively anymore? I think that in many of the congregations, the sound congregations, there's a real hesitancy, and probably there's a decision not to send people to these preacher training schools, but to teach locally within the local congregation. It's sort of gone back to that. Because you go to one of these preacher training schools now, you come back with false doctrine. There was an instance where a young man, actually from Sunset, and this congregation has hired the last 2 or 3 preachers they've hired have been from Sunset, and so he's south of here, heading toward the valley, Central Valley. But he had some of his sermons online, so I went online to listen to them, and it was a 3-part series that was basically leading the congregation into the baptism of the Holy Spirit. The whole idea of this is, once you're baptized, you have the Holy Spirit indwelling, and this indwelling is one that allows you to do different things. So, and listening to those things, I think I sent them a letter or email or something about it, and never heard anything from them. But it was pretty clear that you could go online, you could listen to it. This is what he brought from that school, and oftentimes when young men bring things from schools into congregations. Congregations often differential to the preacher. Well, obviously he knows more than we do. He just came from a preacher training school. Everything that he got there is right and correct and doctrinal. And maybe we just weren't smart enough to see this, and maybe we just didn't understand it. And now he's given us some clarity. And that is a very dangerous approach. And I think that the local men of the congregation have to be able. Paul warns against it in Acts. Jude certainly warns against it. Jesus warns against it as well. People coming into the congregation bringing, as Peter mentions, damnable heresies. And if you are not watching out for that, if you're not, again, Paul says, first of all, now, and again, look at verse 3 in 1 Corinthians 15. I delivered to you that which I also received. So, if Paul had received false doctrine and delivered that false doctrine to Corinth, that would be an influence that they would be under. Now, of course, Corinth has their own problems anyway, but they didn't have a problem with what Paul presented to them, what he delivered to them, because he preached the truth of the gospel. But you can also see how from that enters in that element of danger. If a person delivers something that they received, that's in error. And we have the responsibility at the local congregational level, of course, to confront that error and defend the truth. But I think this is why, to me, and it's just an opinion, so I'm not going to give you a book, chapter, verse on it, but it's an opinion that the local congregation has to take a leading role in the training of its young men and young women in terms of the service as well. The ladies of the congregation probably do it in a little bit different way, but certainly the men of the congregation have a responsibility to those who are, not to get into the translation of the verse and what it really means, but having heard it so many times growing up, coming up in the, not growing up in the church, but coming up in the church, hearing this particular verse, which I think in the translation you can extract from it something that you can use. Train up a child in the way he should go. When he's old, he'll not depart from it. Now that certainly has an idea that's perhaps a little different from the way it sounds, but just the way that translation comes across, just taking that, extracting that itself, you can make an application from that. If you train a person in the gospel the correct way, not to say that they will never depart from it, but at least you will know that you've taught them the right way. It's just like with a parent and a child. A parent can teach a child the right things, to do the right things, be the right example for the child. Maybe when the child turns 40 or 50, they're going to do something, entirely crazy. But at least you know that you gave them the right foundation, that you strengthened them, you built them up in the most holy faith, and that you have, at least for that time period, for that time frame in which they were under your influence, you have given them the opportunity to maintain good works. Local congregations, I think we have to look. We obviously now have to look more internally, look more to ourselves, and to faithful congregations with whom we're in fellowship. I think that may also be a source of preaching material. Young preachers, congregations that have solid, sound preachers, maybe having them sent to another sound congregation. I think that's a way. What do you think about that, Michael?
I think that's a good idea if you have a man with experience and knowledge and sending him to them. But that's basically what you have and how the idea of a preacher training school began.
I know of a few of the congregations. There's smaller groups on the outskirts of where Spring is, and I think John West goes out to one, and I haven't spoken with him in the last week or so, but I think Jeff was going out to speak at a congregation recently. Small group. I don't know the composition of the groups, but I think obviously if they're asking for someone to help come and preach, it could be that they don't have any men, or the men are elderly, or they just have young people. I'm not really sure the makeup of the congregations, but
Mark Townsend has been asked to go out and speak a few times, I know.
Yes, yes. And actually, we're inviting most of those fellows to come to San Mateo in the. I don't know if I mentioned this to you. Next summer, actually, we're trying to do a joint lectureship with the young men and ladies at Spring and the young men and ladies in San Mateo. We're going to try to get them to come out. Logistics is going to be the problem, of course, but try to get them to come out. Mark and Jeff and John and Jonathan. And maybe one other man, and the young ladies to come in and do a ladies presentation on a Saturday, not letting Sonia speak because she's a professional, but some of the younger ladies to present along with our young ladies, and we're hoping that this can be something that is a great benefit and encouragement to all of them in the future. So, anyway, I think we are about next week. What we'll start on is the verses 5 through 7. Look at that and begin to discuss it. That, of course, having to do with those who are eyewitnesses, and certainly probably down through verses 8 through 10. And maybe even into verse 11. So probably try to finish up those verses 5 through 11 next week. We do want to thank all of you who were with us today. We want to thank those of you who may be watching or get the opportunity to watch a little bit later. We hope you'll continue to join us in our discussions in 1 Corinthians. Again, for those of you, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. We want to thank you once again for being with us. Bye-bye.